5 wolves surrounded the new waitress in the dim corner of Chicago's most dangerous district, pinning her to the oak table while their leader filmed her terror, certain that in Southside, no one would dare challenge them. But when the room fell silent, and Vincent Moretti rose from the shadows, his charcoal suit worth more than their lives combined, their laughter choked in their throats before the first bone even cracked. What he did next didn't just save Elena Blackwood, it left a dent in the woods so deep that 6 months later, the whole city still whispers about the night the devil walked out of the darkness to collect his debt. If this story already has you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Share this with someone who loves a good redemption story, trust me. They'll thank you. Now, let's get back to that night in Chicago. Moretti's Corner sat at the corner of Halsted and 47th, right in the beating heart of Chicago's South Side, a place where the light of civilization seemed to have given up long ago. Outside, the streetlights had been shot out years before, and no one ever bothered to replace them, leaving the block drowned in a darkness thick as ink. The red brick walls were blotched with gang graffiti, staking territory the way wild animals mark their hunting grounds. From time to time, a police siren echoed somewhere far off, but it never came close, because on the South Side, the police had learned there were places the law could not reach. And yet, in the middle of that living hell, Moretti's Corner endured like a strange oasis, a refuge time itself had forgotten. A heavy oak door with a tarnished brass handle guarded a world that felt entirely different. Warm yellow light spilled down from old-fashioned chandeliers, bathing everything in a gentle amber glow. Jazz threaded through the room from an old record player set in the corner, the saxophone low and intimate, like the whisper of a former lover. The smell of dark roasted coffee mingled with the scent of wood polished in lemon oil, creating a signature fragrance that anyone who had ever stepped inside would never forget. Oak tables were worn smooth and shining, chairs were upholstered in deep wine, red leather, and on the walls hung black and white photographs of Chicago in the 1950s, back when the city carried a raw beauty and a different kind of danger. Harold Chen, the owner, was a 62-year-old Asian-American man whose hair had gone almost completely gray and whose small eyes always held a quiet kindness. He had bought the place 30 years earlier, when the South Side first began to sink into darkness, and he stayed when everyone else ran. No one understood why, and no one dared to ask. Harold moved from table to table with the soft steps of a man practiced in not drawing attention, always smiling, always nodding and greeting, never asking his customers anything beyond what they wanted to order. In the kitchen, Rosa Martinez ruled her own kingdom with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. This 55-year-old woman wore her thick black hair pinned high, her brown eyes warm, her heart so large it seemed capable of holding the pain of the whole world. Rosa cooked as if every plate were a prayer, and she treated the staff as if they were the children she never had. When someone was hurting, Rosa knew before they could manage a single word, and a bowl of hot soup would appear in front of them like a small miracle. On the South Side, everyone knew about Moretti's Corner, but not because the food was good or the atmosphere was warm. They knew because of an unwritten rule that had existed for so long no one could remember when it began. The rule was simple. No one caused trouble at Moretti's Corner. Not gangs, not thugs, not drunks. Those who broke that rule had a way of disappearing, sometimes within only a few hours of leaving the restaurant, and no one ever found them. Rumors spread that the place was protected, though not a soul knew by whom. Some said it was the devil, others whispered about the Mafia, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whoever the protector was, he was not someone you wanted to provoke, and so Moretti's Corner remained, a bubble of peace inside a storm of chaos, a place where the exhausted could find a few hours of rest before stepping back out into the darkness beyond. Elena Blackwood stood behind the polished mahogany bar, her hands clenched around a damp wiping cloth so tightly her knuckles went white. She was 27, yet under the soft golden light of Moretti's Corner she looked younger, more fragile, as if life had wrung her dry before she ever had the chance to live it all the way through. This was her 5th night working here. 5 nights since Harold Chen had looked into her panicked eyes and nodded yes without asking a single question. Elena's dark brown hair was twisted into a tight bun at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place, as though she feared the smallest looseness might be enough for someone to recognize her. The white shirt she wore was buttoned all the way to her throat, the long sleeves pulled down to cover her wrists, and she made certain not a centimeter of skin showed beyond what was necessary. Her eyes were the most striking thing about her, a pale green like new spring leaves, but inside them lived something that had shattered long ago, something even the warmest light could never fully thaw. Every few seconds those eyes drifted toward the door. Each time the brass bell above it rang, Elena's heart slammed so hard she could feel it in her throat. in her temples, in the tips of her fingers. She would lift her head, sweep her gaze across the face of whoever had just stepped in, and only when she confirmed it was a stranger did she allow herself to breathe out. It was a survival reflex she had developed over the past 3 years, ever since she learned there were men in this world who did not accept no, and there were doors that, once shut, became prisons. Rosa Martinez had noticed it the very first night Elena came in asking for work, the older woman's eyes pausing on the faint bruises along the young woman's neck, bruises that had yellowed with time but had not fully faded. Rosa said nothing, only led Elena into the kitchen, set a bowl of hot soup in front of her, and sat across from her until she finished every last bite. Elena needed this job more than she needed anything. She needed cash, the kind pressed into her hand and never routed through any system. No tax records, no name in a payroll book, no electronic trace that could be followed. Over the past 4 months, she had run through 4 cities, each stop shorter than the last as fear caught up with her and forced her to move again. Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and now Chicago. Each city meant a new name, a new story, a new disguise thrown together in haste before it could be torn away. Elena Blackwood was not even her real name, only the name she chose when she stepped off a Greyhound bus at the Southside station, the name she scribbled on the job application with a trembling hand. Sometimes, when the restaurant was quiet and Elena stood alone behind the bar, she would unconsciously tug her sleeves a little lower, making sure the white cotton covered her wrists. Beneath that fabric were scars, not deep but not fully faded either, parallel lines like a map of the darkest nights of her life. She had not done it because she wanted to die. She had done it because it was the only way she could feel something other than numbness, the only way she could remind herself she was still alive when everything around her made her want to disappear. Those scars belonged to a different Elena, a younger, weaker girl, a girl who had believed love meant enduring and forgiveness meant forgetting. The Elena of the present had learned that real love never leaves bruises, and forgiveness does not mean staying. But here, inside Moretti's corner, among the smell of coffee and the hush of jazz, Elena found something she had thought she would never feel again. Safety. Not perfect safety, not the kind she could trust without question, but a small breath of air in the middle of an endless storm of panic. There was something about this place, about the way Harold Chen never asked where she came from, about the way Rosa Martinez looked at her with understanding instead of pity, about the way the customers here seemed to carry secrets of their own, and no one cared to pry into anyone else's. There was something about that unwritten rule she had heard Harold whisper to Rosa in the kitchen, about how this place was protected by someone no soul dared to anger. Elena did not know who that protector was, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place the darkness of her past could not reach. Leading the group was a man who, with one look, could make the most primal survival instinct in a person scream in alarm. Derek Lawson, 29 years old, was known on the South Side streets by the nickname The Bull, and it was not an exaggeration. He had a body that looked as if it had been poured from steroids and dark intentions, every muscle swelling beneath skin stretched glossy tight, as if it might burst. His neck practically did not exist, his head seeming to sit directly on his shoulders in a solid block like stone. His face was broad, his jaw square, and he wore a permanent sneer, the kind of smile a man carries when he believes the world was made to serve him, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool who needs to be taught. He wore a fitted black suit jacket over a white t-shirt, the seams pulled so tight they looked ready to split, and beneath that cloth were tattoos that crawled from his wrists up to his neck, violent and lethal images etched into flesh like a declaration of what he truly was. Derek stepped into Moretti's corner, not like a customer, but like a conqueror, inspecting a village he had just taken. Each footfall landed heavy on the wooden floor, the soles of his combat boots striking like war drums. His eyes, small and sharp like a wild boar's, swept the room with a cruel kind of amusement, measuring every face, every table, every exit as if he were mapping out a fight that had not yet begun. Behind him, 4 more figures spread out like wolves trailing their pack leader, each carrying his own shade of dark energy. Tyler, close on Derek's right, was a skinny man with an acne-scarred face and a disgusting grin that never went away, the grin of someone who found pleasure in other people's pain. His hand hovered ready with his phone, his thumb sliding over the screen, as if he were waiting for something worth recording. Jason stood to the left, a younger guy in black-framed glasses who kept pushing them up the bridge of his nose with his index finger, his eyes behind the lenses darting non-stop, sweeping every corner like a rat hunting for cheese or an escape route. Kevin was frightening in a different way, with a baby face, pale skin, and cheeks still carrying a little softness from adolescence, but his blue eyes were ice-cold and completely empty, without even a flicker of conscience or empathy. The fourth was the biggest one after Derek, over 6 feet tall with shoulders as wide as a door, and he said nothing, only stood there like a wall of meat. Lifeless eyes fixed straight ahead, a tool of violence waiting to be used. The air in the restaurant thickened into something like gelatin. The elderly couple near the window immediately lowered their heads toward their plates, their hands gripping each other so hard their knuckles turned white, neither of them daring to look up or breathe too loudly. The man drinking alone shrank into his chair, trying to take up as little space as possible, eyes pinned to his beer bottle as if it were the most interesting object in the universe. This was the survival instinct of the South Side, sharpened across generations of living amid violence and danger. Do not make eye contact. Do not draw attention. Do not intervene. Pretend you see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing. And maybe, just maybe, you will make it home tonight without losing anything. Elena stood frozen behind the bar, completely alone. Tommy, the host who usually stood at the door, had asked to leave early because of a stomachache, and now she understood it might not have been a stomachache at all, but the intuition of someone who had lived long enough on the South Side to know when it was time to vanish. Harold Chen had quietly retreated into the kitchen the instant the door was shoved open, his shape dissolving into the space behind like smoke, leaving Elena alone to face the wolves moving in. She could hear hurried whispers in the kitchen, Rosa's voice saying something urgent, but the kitchen door stayed shut tight. She understood. In a place like this, everyone survived the way they could, and Elena was the newcomer, the one with no one to protect her, the one who belonged nowhere. She felt Derek Lawson's gaze rake across the room and stop on her, as if he had just spotted tonight's prey, and in that instant, every hope she had ever held about finding a safe refuge began to splinter, like glass hitting a stone floor. Derek Lawson swept his gaze across the room again, and this time his small, sharp eyes stopped and locked onto Elena behind the bar. A slow smile spread across his coarse face, the kind of smile a predator wears when it spots a lone fawn. "Hey, sweetheart." His voice came out low and thick, cutting through the jazz that was trying to fill the tense emptiness in the air. "You're new. I haven't seen you around here before." He lingered on each word as if tasting it on his tongue, and the way he said new made Elena feel as though she'd been stripped bare in front of everyone. His 4 underlings snickered, the ugly sound rising like vultures waiting for a meal. Elena drew in a deep breath and tried to steady herself. She had faced men like this before. She had survived. She would survive this time too. With hands trembling just enough that she prayed no one would notice, she reached for 5 leather-bound menus from the rack beside the bar, pressed them to her chest like a thin shield, and stepped out from the relative safety behind the counter. Each step on the wooden floor felt heavy as lead, and she could feel Derek's eyes burning into her skin as she walked toward table 12, the large round table in the middle of the restaurant that they had claimed without anyone needing to guide them. "Right this way, gentlemen," she said, her voice sounding far calmer than what was happening inside her. Table for 5. They did not sit like ordinary customers. They sprawled into their chairs, legs stretched out to block the aisle, elbows planted on the tabletop, taking up space aggressively as if the entire restaurant belonged to them. Derek took the central seat, leaning back, both arms spread along the backs of the chairs on either side, and when Elena set the menu in front of him, he did not even glance at it. Instead, his eyes moved slowly over her body, from her worn black flats, up her legs in slacks, past the white shirt buttoned tight to her throat, and finally to her face. He looked at her the way a man looks at merchandise laid out for sale, weighing every detail, and the smile on his mouth widened as he watched her fight not to tremble under that stare. Tyler, the acne-faced one with the disgusting grin, was the first to speak. "I want a beer," he said, his voice high and grating like fingernails on a chalkboard. Then he leaned forward, the smile on his face twisting into a suggestive smirk. "And I want to know what time you get off." The whole table burst into laughter, sharp and crude, ringing through the restaurant and making the elderly couple shrink in their seats and the man drinking alone try to fold himself even smaller. Jason shoved his glasses up the bridge of his nose and laughed loudly, while Kevin only curled his mouth, his ice-cold eyes fixed on Elena with a sick kind of pleasure. The big one standing behind them did not laugh at all. He only watched, and somehow his silence was more frightening than the other's noise. Elena swallowed, her throat dry as a desert. "I'll get your drinks," she said quickly, her voice catching on the last note, and she turned to leave. She needed to get away from here, to put distance between herself and this pack of wolves, to breathe, to think, to find a way to survive. But she had barely taken 2 steps when a hand shot out like a striking snake and clamped around her wrist. Derek Lawson's hand, large and rough, fingers thick as sausages, a grip as hard as steel pliers. Elena's mouth fell open, a small sound tearing loose from her throat as pain flashed from her wrist up her arm. She tried to jerk free, but it was useless. He was too strong, and every time she struggled, his grip tightened. "I wasn't done talking to you, sweetheart," Derek said, his voice sweet in a poisonous way. "It's rude to walk away when someone's talking to you. Didn't your mama teach you manners?" He yanked her closer, and Elena could smell his breath, sour with cheap whiskey and cigarettes, the smell of nightmares she thought she had left behind. And in that moment, a wave of memory surged over her like floodwater breaking a levee. This hand, this grip, this helplessness. She had felt it all before, in a small apartment in Detroit, under the hands of Marcus Webb, the man she had once loved and trusted before he turned her life into hell. Marcus had grabbed her wrist like this too. Every time she tried to run, every time she dared to have her own opinion, every time she showed even the smallest sign that she was a human being with a will and not an object. "Please," Elena whispered, and her voice was no longer the voice of a 27-year-old woman standing in a restaurant in Chicago. It was the voice of the 23-year-old girl from years ago, kneeling on a kitchen floor with blood on her lip and tears streaming from eyes that had lost all hope. "Please, let go." Derek did not let go. Instead, he yanked her, a sudden, brutal jerk that stole Elena's balance completely. The world around her spun into a moment of chaos. Her feet left the floor, and before she could even understand what was happening, her back slammed down onto the oak tabletop at table 12. The impact cracked through the room like thunder, the wood groaning under her weight, and the air was punched out of her lungs in a painful oof. The ceiling wheeled above her, the old chandeliers blurring into streaks of yellow light, and she tried to breathe in, but her lungs refused to work, locking down in panic. She tried to push herself up, survival screaming in her head to run, to get away, to do anything to escape. But before she could lift her face from the tabletop, a massive hand came down on her shoulder and pinned her to the wood the way you pin a butterfly to a collector's board. Derek Lawson rose from his chair, looming like a mountain that could move, and leaned down over her. His face filled Elena's vision, the coarse features, the small sharp eyes glittering with enjoyment, and the sneer stretching into a wide, vicious grin. The weight of his hand on her shoulder felt like a boulder, and no matter how she twisted, how she fought, how she tried to wrench herself free, he did not budge. He was too strong, too big, and she was too small, too fragile, too helpless. His 4 underlings crowded around the table like vultures circling a carcass, their faces sliding into Elena's peripheral vision like ghosts from hell. Tyler lifted his phone, the bright screen aimed straight at her, and the flash flared, blinding, as he started recording. "Oh man, this is gold," he giggled, his thin voice full of delight. "The boys back home are gonna love this." The stench flooded Elena's nose, a disgusting mix of cheap cologne, the kind men buy at a dollar store hoping it will make them seem refined, only to end up smelling like the lowest grade brothel. Mixed into it were cigarette smoke, old sweat, beer, and something else she could not name but her body recognized instantly. The scent of danger, the smell of violence boiling just under the surface, waiting to break free. She wanted to vomit, wanted to scream, wanted to vanish, but her throat tightened and nothing came out but broken, ragged breaths. Tears began to spill from the corners of her eyes, hot and salty, pouring out without control like a dam that had just burst. She did not want to cry, did not want them to see her weakness, did not want to become entertainment for them, but her body betrayed her. The tears slid down her cheeks and fell onto the oak table, and she could hear their laughter rising like wolves howling in the night. Jason roared with laughter, shoving his glasses up his nose as he leaned in for a better look. Kevin stood at the end of the table, ice-cold eyes fixed on her with a sick pleasure he did not bother to hide. The big one blocked the aisle with his arms folded across his chest, a wall of flesh that let no one come in and no one get out. "Look at her shake," Derek bellowed, his voice filling the restaurant, not bothering to lower it because he knew no one in this room would dare interfere. "Look at her cry. Pathetic." Inside Elena's head, the world began to shrink, narrowing into a black tunnel made of nothing but fear and despair. She had been here before, not in this restaurant, not under Derek Lawson's hands, but somewhere that felt exactly like this. The apartment in Detroit, the cold kitchen floor, Marcus's hand pressing down on her throat, squeezing until bright specks danced in front of her eyes. "Here we go again," a voice in her mind whispered, a voice that had broken long ago, and no longer had the strength to fight. Just like Marcus, I can't get out. I'm never going to get out. She had run through 4 cities, changed her name, erased every trace, tried to rebuild herself from ash, and still it ended like this. Flat on her back on a table, a man holding her down, laughter closing in around her from men who saw her as a toy. Maybe this was her fate. Maybe she had been marked from birth to be a victim, and no matter where she ran, no matter how hard she tried, she would never escape that shadow. Elena closed her eyes, and darkness dropped over her like a blanket. She no longer saw Derek's face, no longer saw the flash from Tyler's phone, no longer saw the ceiling spinning, only darkness, and within that darkness she whispered a prayer she no longer believed would be answered. "Please," she breathed, her voice barely more than air, a thin thread holding her to hope. "Please, someone, anyone." But on the south side of Chicago, no one answered prayers. Here, everyone survived alone, and Elena knew she was not strong. She never had been, and tonight, she would pay for that weakness. But there was one person in this room who did not follow the South Side rule. In the farthest corner of the restaurant, where the yellow light could not reach, and the darkness lay thick as ink, there was a booth most people forgot even existed. That booth did not live on the mental map of ordinary customers, as if their minds automatically slid past it whenever their eyes swept the room. But tonight, it was not empty. Vincent Moretti sat there alone, sunk into the dark as if he were part of it, as if he had been born from shadow and could dissolve back into it at any moment. He had been sitting there since 7 o'clock in the evening, more than an hour before the door was kicked open. And the entire time he had not moved, had not spoken to anyone, only sat and watched like a statue carved from stone and night. Vincent Moretti was 36, but his eyes were far older than his years, old as if they had witnessed every crime a human mind could invent and had stopped being shocked long ago. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind only master tailors in Milan could make, with stitching so fine it was almost invisible, and fabric soft as silk, yet draping with the weight of true luxury. That suit cost more than the building that held it, more than everything Derek Lawson and his men owned put together, but Vincent wore it with the indifference of someone so used to expensive things they had become meaningless. His shirt collar was open, no tie, revealing the base of his throat where black tattoos climbed like poisonous vines, inked lines telling the story of a life written in blood and violence and power. The tattoos rose from his chest to his neck, half hidden beneath the collar, a quiet warning to anyone who noticed that this was not a man to provoke. In front of Vincent sat an espresso that had gone cold long ago. He did not drink it, had never intended to. The cup was only an excuse to be here, a prop in the play he was directing. His face was a mask of stone, unreadable and empty, features sharp and angular as if chiseled from granite, a square jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the color of steel, cold as a Siberian winter. He had watched everything from the instant the 5 figures blasted through the door and poured into the restaurant like a pack of starving wolves. He had noted the way Derek Lawson moved like a conqueror, registered each face of the 4 men behind him, measured the danger of each and sorted them in his mind with the calm precision of someone who had killed more people than he could remember. He had watched the brown-haired waitress too, the way she tried to stay composed as she carried the menus to their table, the faint tremor in her hands that she tried to hide, the way she swallowed before she spoke, and how her voice came out steadier than her body betrayed. He saw a survivor, someone who had faced monsters before and learned how to disguise fear. When Derek grabbed her wrist, Vincent did not move. When she was yanked off balance and her back slammed onto the oak table, he remained still as a statue. When the wolves laughed and the phone flash burst bright, he did not stir. Vincent Moretti was not a hero, had never called himself one, and he had lived long enough to know heroes usually died young and pointless. He was a businessman, in the politest sense of the word, a man who managed an underground empire that stretched across Chicago and far beyond, a man whose name was whispered in fear by those who knew better and completely unknown to those who lived in the light. He did not interfere in things like this. It was not his business. It was the police's business, the business of good citizens, the business of anyone but him. But then, in a brief sliver of time between laughter and flashing light, Vincent's eyes met Elena's. She lay on the table, tears running down her cheeks, and when she opened her eyes one last time before closing them in despair, her gaze drifted by accident toward the dark corner where he sat. And in that thousandth of a second, Vincent saw something that made his entire body go tight. He saw fear in those pale green eyes, the primal fear of prey driven into a corner. But more than fear, he saw the moment fear turned into something far worse: despair, surrender. The look of someone who had stopped fighting, stopped hoping, accepted that this was how it would end. He had seen that look before, 24 years earlier, in his mother's eyes when she lay on a kitchen floor with blood soaking her flowered dress, and a rival gang stood around her laughing like demons from hell. A switch flipped deep inside Vincent Moretti's moral wiring he believed had died long ago, wiring he had buried beneath layers of ice and deliberate indifference. It did not flip because he was good. It flipped because there were lines even monsters were not allowed to cross, and Derek Lawson had just leaped over that line as if it did not exist. Vincent's finger tapped the tabletop once, twice, 3 times, a slow rhythm like a countdown to the end of the world. Then he placed both hands on the table, and for the first time in more than an hour, Vincent Moretti moved. The scrape of a chair against the floor rang through the restaurant like thunder under a clear sky. It was the only sound in a room that had suddenly gone so still it felt suffocating. Wood grinding against wood as Vincent Moretti pushed his chair back and rose from his booth of darkness. It was not loud, but in the silence that had settled over the restaurant since Elena had been slammed onto the table, it echoed like a funeral bell. Everyone in the room heard it. Everyone turned to look, except Derek Lawson, too busy savoring his own power to notice the air had just changed completely. The elderly couple near the window were the first to understand what was coming. They did not speak, did not trade a glance. They simply stood at the same time with the quiet of people who had lived long enough on the south side to recognize the scent of death when it drifted through the air. The husband left a few bills on the table, the wife took her purse, and both of them moved toward the back door in silence, their steps light as feathers, not making a sound. They slipped through the door that led to the alley before anyone in Derek's group even realized they had ever been there. The man drinking alone moved too, faster and with less finesse. He sprang up, knocking his chair over, but no one looked back because every set of eyes was fixed on the shape stepping out of the dark corner. He ran for the front door, shoulder bumping the wall in panic, and disappeared into the cold Chicago night outside. In the kitchen, Rosa Martinez had seen everything through the cracked door. She grabbed Harold Chen's arm with a grip strong enough to leave bruises, and hauled him deeper into the kitchen with the surprising strength of a 55-year-old woman. Harold started to protest, his mouth opening to say something, but Rosa pressed a finger to his lips and shook her head hard. She pulled the kitchen door shut, all the way, for the first time tonight, and the latch clicked, small but final. They knew what was about to happen, and they knew the best thing they could do was not be there when it did. Now, inside Moretti's corner, only 7 people remained. Elena lay on the table, tears still flowing, eyes squeezed shut. Derek Lawson stood beside her with his hand still crushing her shoulder, utterly unaware of the storm moving in. His 4 men circled the table, Tyler still filming, Jason still chuckling, Kevin still staring with those cold eyes, the big one still planted like a wall of flesh, and Vincent Moretti, the man in the expensive charcoal suit, was walking toward them with the measured pace of death itself, step by step, slow and deliberate. Each of Vincent's footsteps on the wooden floor sounded like a countdown, like the ticking of a clock measuring the last seconds before a bomb went off. He did not rush, did not hurry. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew time belonged to him and no one could take it away. His shadow stretched across the floor as he left the darkness, and for the first time the restaurant's yellow light fell across his face, and what it revealed made Tyler, the first to see him clearly, stop laughing mid-breath. That face held no expression at all, completely empty, like the mask of a god of death come to harvest souls. The steel-gray eyes did not blink, did not waver. They stared straight ahead with the focus of a predator that had already locked onto its target. Tyler lowered his phone, the disgusting grin vanishing from his acne-marked face. Jason stopped laughing, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose in a nervous gesture. Kevin narrowed his eyes, and for the first time something other than coldness surfaced in that icy gaze, something that looked like uncertainty. The big man uncrossed his arms and straightened, muscles tightening into a stance ready to fight. Only Derek, only the foolish leader, still did not understand what was happening. He was still smiling, still saying something to Elena, still savoring the moment of his power, until he noticed his men had gone quiet and were staring at something behind him. Derek turned, and his smile died on his lips. Standing in front of him, only a few steps away, was a man he had never seen in his life. A man in a suit more expensive than anything Derek had ever worn, with tattoos crawling up his throat and eyes cold as an Arctic winter. "Who the fuck are you?" Derek snarled, his voice trying to hold on to its swagger, but a faint tremor slipped into the last word that he could not control. Vincent Moretti did not answer. He only stood there, watching Derek with those steel-gray eyes, and his silence was more terrifying than any threat. In those eyes there was no anger, no outrage, only a calm, ruthless calculation, as if he were deciding where to begin. Derek Lawson let go of Elena's shoulder and turned fully to face the stranger who dared to challenge him. When he straightened, puffing out his chest like a bear trying to look bigger, he realized he stood at least half a head taller than the man in front of him. The discovery fed his confidence, and the familiar sneer slowly returned to his coarse face. He had dropped men much bigger than this, had crushed people who thought they were heroes, and the guy in the expensive suit would not be an exception. "You got a death wish, old man," Derek bellowed, his voice filling the restaurant with the swagger of someone used to bullying others and never paying for it. "You know who I am. I run these streets. I own this neighborhood. And you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Vincent Moretti stood motionless, not a muscle in his face reacting to the threat. Then he spoke, and his voice came out like steel ground on stone, cold and sharp enough to cut the air. "I know exactly who you are, Derek Lawson." Derek's name fell from Vincent's mouth like a death sentence, every syllable pronounced clearly and slowly. 29 years old, born in Gary, Indiana, moved to Chicago at 17, ran with the Southside Kings until you decided you were too big for them. Now you think you're a wolf, but you're nothing more than a dog that's forgotten its leash. Derek flinched as if someone had thrown ice water in his face. He knew his name. He knew his past. He knew things only a handful of people knew. Suddenly the confidence began to crack, and a cold feeling crawled up Derek's spine like the fingers of death. Kevin was the first one in the group to understand. The baby-faced underling with ice-cold eyes had heard the stories, had seen the photographs in meetings he never should have been allowed into. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse, and his voice came out as a panicked whisper. Boss, wait!" Kevin stepped back one pace, then two, his eyes never leaving the man in the charcoal suit. That's Vincent Moretti." The name dropped into the group like an atomic bomb. Tyler let his phone fall, the screen shattering when it hit the floor, but he did not even bend to pick it up. Jason backed away until his spine met the wall, his glasses fogging with sweat. The big man stood frozen, all the aggression drained from his posture, replaced by the primal fear of prey, realizing it is standing in front of the apex predator. Derek's face changed in an instant. The red of anger and arrogance drained away like water slipping through fingers, replaced by the pale wash of pure fear. He knew that name. Everyone on the South Side knew that name. Vincent Moretti, the boss of the Moretti family, the man who controlled half of Chicago from the shadows, the one the police did not dare touch and the gangs did not dare mention. There were stories about what happened to people who crossed his line, stories about bodies that were never found, and men who vanished without leaving a trace. Derek had thought he was a wolf, but what stood in front of him now was a monster wolves bowed to. Vincent watched fear spread through Derek's group, with the indifference of someone who had seen it too many times. Then he said, his tone calm as if he were discussing the weather, "You have 5 seconds to apologize to the lady and leave this restaurant. If you do that, you walk out of here with your legs intact." He paused just long enough for the words to sink in. 5. Derek did not move, his jaw dropping open but no sound coming out. 4. Tyler started edging toward the door, but a look from Vincent locked him in place. 3. Jason was shaking, sweat pouring down his face. 2. Kevin dropped to his knees, head bowed as if he were praying. Derek opened his mouth, trying to force something out. Maybe an apology, maybe a plea, but his throat had gone dry, and not a single word escaped. 1. The silence stretched for 1 heartbeat, then 2, and Derek still stood frozen like a pillar of salt, too shocked, too terrified to do anything. Vincent stared at him without blinking, and a thin smile, sharp as a blade, appeared on his mouth for the first time that night. "Time's up." Vincent moved, with no warning, no preparatory motion. Only the instant he was still, and the next instant he was right in front of Derek, a speed the naked eye could not track, the speed of a man tempered in violence since childhood, the speed of death when it finally decides to harvest. Vincent's hand shot out, long, strong fingers seizing the back of Derek's head, gripping the short hair that stood stiff as steel, and in one single motion, smooth as running water, he smashed Derek's face down into the oak tabletop. The sound detonated in the enclosed space like thunder, a dry crack of bone meeting wood as Derek's nose broke under the impact. Blood sprayed across the table like red paint, hot drops spattering outward, and Derek screamed a sound that did not belong to any man, the howl of a wounded animal, of someone learning for the first time what real pain was. Tyler reacted first, survival instinct kicking in when his leader went down, and he lunged at Vincent with a raised fist, shouting something meaningless, but he was slow, far too slow, like a fly drifting into a spider's web. Vincent turned with deadly grace, caught the incoming wrist, and twisted, and the snap of bone rang out, dry and sharp like a branch breaking in winter, and Tyler shrieked. His wrist folded at an impossible angle, bone bulging beneath the skin as if it wanted to tear free, and the phone he had been using to film fell to the floor, the screen still lit, still recording, while Vincent calmly stepped on it, heel grinding the device into shards of plastic and glass. Tyler collapsed, clutching the broken wrist, tears and snot running down his acne-marked face. Jason was next, the man with the glasses charging from behind, maybe thinking an attack from a blind spot would give him an advantage. A mistake. Vincent did not even turn around. He simply shifted one step to the side with a dancer's precision, letting Jason's own momentum carry him forward. Then Vincent's hand grabbed the back of Jason's head and drove it hard. Jason's skull struck the brick wall with a dull thud like a watermelon hitting the ground. His glasses shattered, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes, unconscious before he finished falling, blood beginning to seep from a cut on his forehead and stain his sandy hair. Kevin had drawn a knife, and while Vincent dealt with the other two, the baby-faced underling with the cold eyes had pulled a switchblade from his back pocket, the steel blade gleaming under the yellow light. He did not rush in like the others. He waited, he calculated, and when Vincent turned toward him, he slashed with the precision of someone used to using a knife. But Vincent was more precise. He stepped into Kevin's reach instead of away from it, caught the knife wrist with one hand, and bent it back with just enough force to make Kevin's fingers open. The knife fell. Vincent caught it in midair, and in a motion as fluid as a dance, he drove it down into Kevin's thigh. The blade punched through denim, through skin, through muscle, and sank deep into flesh. Kevin screamed, a scream that tore at the throat, and crumpled to the floor with the knife still embedded in his leg as blood began to soak his jeans. The big man was the only one still standing, and he had seen everything. His leader's face smashed into the table, his partners dropped one by one in less than 30 seconds, and whatever loyalty or courage he had evaporated, like morning fog under the sun. He turned and ran, bolting for the front door with a speed a man his size should not have been able to reach, and Vincent did not chase him. He stood where he was, watching the fleeing back, and his voice carried with a calmness that sounded like casual conversation. Tell everyone what you saw tonight. Tell them what happens when someone forgets the rules in my restaurant. The big man did not look back. He only shoved the door open and vanished into the night, carrying a story that would be told and retold for years. Vincent turned back to Derek, the leader trying to push himself up, blood pouring from the broken nose. But before he could stand, Vincent's hand seized his hair again. This time Vincent hauled Derek's head up high enough for him to see, to look through swollen, terrified eyes, and then Vincent drove him down again, and again, each impact measured, each one aimed at the same spot on the tabletop, and when the final blow ended, Derek lay motionless, his face slick with blood, and in the oak surface a deep dent had appeared, wood crushed under the repeated force, a permanent scar on the polished sheen. Vincent looked at the dent, then down at Derek, and his voice was ice. This table, this mark, it stays. A reminder for anyone who forgets. He released Derek's hair, letting the head hit the table one last time, gentler than before but still enough to draw a groan. Now crawl out of my restaurant, and if I ever see your face again, they will not find enough of you to bury. The silence after violence was heavier than any scream. Inside Moretti's corner, there was no more ugly laughter, no more shouting, only the ragged breathing of the injured and the jazz still playing from the old record player in the corner, the saxophone line mournful as a funeral hymn. Derek Lawson and his men were scattered across the floor like puppets with their strings cut, groaning, bleeding, no longer the fierce wolves they had been minutes ago, only pathetic creatures trying to drag themselves toward the door. Elena was still on the table, exactly where Derek had left her, eyes squeezed shut, body rigid as if she were bracing for the next blow. She could not believe it was over, could not trust the sudden quiet, could not bring herself to open her eyes because she was afraid this was only an illusion and reality would crush her again. Vincent Moretti stood beside the table, less than a step away from Elena, but he did not touch her. He kept the hand that still carried Derek's blood held off to the side, and he stood still, waiting, giving her time to understand the nightmare had passed. He had seen this reaction before in people who had suffered so much they no longer believed in rescue, in people hurt so deeply that even a helping hand made them flinch. He knew that touching her now would only make it worse, so he stayed there, a patient statue amid the wreckage, and waited until she was ready. "It's over," he said, and this time his voice was no longer steel ground on stone. It was softer, lower, like rain on a roof. "They won't touch you again. No one will." Elena opened her eyes, slowly, as if her eyelids weighed 1,000 pounds, as if light itself might burn her if she looked too quickly. The first thing she saw was the ceiling with its old chandeliers, then the oak tabletop beside her head with smeared blood and the fresh, deep dent. Then she turned her face, and her pale green eyes met the steel-gray eyes looking down at her. It was the first time she truly looked into Vincent Moretti's eyes, and what she found there startled her so completely she forgot to breathe. There was no cruelty, no threat, nothing she had ever seen in the eyes of men who had hurt her. Only a deep calm, and buried beneath that ice, a spark she could not name, maybe understanding, maybe pain that had cooled long ago. "Can you stand?" Vincent asked, and he held his hand out, palm up, an invitation without pressure. Elena stared at that hand, the hand that had crushed 5 men in less than a minute, the hand with long, strong fingers that had slammed Derek's head into the table without hesitation, and yet now it waited, patient, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply there if she wanted it. She swallowed hard, and with an act that took more courage than anything she had ever done, she placed her hand in his. Vincent's skin was warm, warmer than she expected, and his fingers closed around hers as gently as if he were holding a newborn bird. He helped her sit up, slowly, and when she swung her legs down from the table and tried to stand, her knees buckled, the world tilted, and she almost fell. But Vincent was there, his hand catching her elbow with just enough strength to steady her, not gripping, not controlling, only supporting. "Easy," he said. "Take your time." The kitchen door flew open and Rosa Martinez burst out like a storm, tears streaming down her lined cheeks, and she ran to Elena and wrapped her in an embrace, her soft, warm arms pulling the young woman tight against her chest as if she feared that if she let go, Elena would vanish. Mija! Mija!" Rosa sobbed, Spanish tangled with English in the rush of emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have done something. I should have." But the words broke apart into choking sobs, and she could only hold Elena tighter, stroking her hair, whispering comforts that were useless and yet honest down to the bone. Harold Chen came out behind her, his old face pale and full of regret, his hands trembling as he stood there not knowing what to do, able only to repeat, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Vincent stepped back to give Rosa space to hold Elena, then turned to Harold, his voice settling back into its usual coldness. "I'll cover the damages. All of it. The table stays as it is, but anything else that needs replacing, send the bill to me." He paused, his steel-gray eyes passing over Elena once more. "And double her salary. She's earned it." Harold nodded again and again like a puppet, not daring to meet Vincent's gaze, agreeing to everything the Mafia boss said. Vincent pulled his phone from his suit pocket and made a short call. "Dominic. Moretti's corner. Cleanup needed. 5 packages. Still breathing. Needs to be removed before morning." He ended the call, slipped the phone away, and walked toward the door. But before he stepped out, he stopped and looked back at Elena one last time. She stood in Rosa's arms, eyes red and swollen from crying, but she was looking at him, and in that look there was a question she could not bring herself to speak. "Same time tomorrow," Vincent said, and his voice was neither a promise nor an order, only a fact. 7 in the evening. I'll be at my usual table." Then he stepped into the night, the door closing behind him, and Elena stood there watching him go, not yet knowing that her life had just changed forever. A week had passed since that fateful night, and everything at Moretti's corner had changed in ways Elena never could have predicted. Every evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy oak door would open, and Vincent Moretti would step inside, always alone, always in perfectly tailored suits that cost more than most people made in a year, always with that expressionless face like a stone mask. He would walk straight to the booth in the farthest corner where the shadows were thickest, sit down with his back to the wall and his eyes angled toward the door, and order an espresso he rarely finished. His steady, regular arrival was a message delivered night after night, a reminder to anyone watching that this place belonged to him, that the people inside were protected by a force no one dared challenge. Rumors spread like wildfire through the South Side in the days that followed, whispered in filthy bars, passed mouth to ear in dark alleys, retold with reverence by those who had heard the story from the big man who escaped that night, Moretti's territory. Touch no one. Never set foot in that restaurant unless you want to eat. Never look wrong at the brown-haired waitress. Never forget the devil is sitting in the dark corner and he never sleeps. The result was simple. No thug dared step through the doors of Moretti's corner anymore. The hard faces that used to drift in now and then for free food and to harass the staff vanished completely, as if an invisible circle of protection had been drawn around the restaurant, and anyone with bad intentions was pushed back by a force they could not see. The customers now were ordinary people, tired workers coming off a shift, couples looking for a quiet dinner, older folks who wanted to sip coffee and remember the old days. They came, they ate, they paid, and they left without anyone being threatened, without anyone being bothered, without anyone having to lower their eyes to avoid the stare of someone stronger. It was the kind of peace the South Side rarely knew, and it was bought at the price of the fear Vincent Moretti's name could summon. Elena watched him every night from behind the bar, her green eyes sliding again and again toward the dark booth where he sat. At first, she was still afraid. Of course she was. He was Mafia, a boss, a man who had crushed 5 men in less than a minute without even changing his breathing. She had seen him in motion, had seen the cold, calculated violence in every choice he made, and she knew he was dangerous in ways Derek Lawson could only dream of. But as the days passed, as she carried his espresso to the table and he nodded his thanks, as their eyes met by accident and he did not rush to look away, she began to understand something. He did not look at her the way Derek had. There was no hunger in it, no ownership, no gaze that measured her like a thing for sale. When Vincent Moretti looked at her, he simply looked, as if she were a person and not an object, as if she had value beyond anything her body could offer. He began to ask about her day, not intrusive questions, not curiosity about her past, only simple ones. How was today? Any difficult customers? Did Rosa make the special tomato soup today? And when Elena answered, he listened, really listened, not the polite kind of listening where a man's mind is already somewhere else, but the kind that made her feel as if what she said mattered, as if she mattered. Each night when she brought the check, he left a tip 10 times what he owed, bills folded neatly under the espresso saucer. The first time she saw that money, she tried to give it back, but something in Vincent's eyes told her refusing would be an insult, so she kept it, and she no longer had to worry about rent or the electric bill. The first slow night came on the 8th day. Rain came down hard outside, that bone-cold Chicago rain that makes people stay home, and the restaurant stood empty except for Vincent in the dark corner booth and Elena behind the bar. Rosa had gone home early because she was sick. Harold was in the office doing the books, and the silence in the room was broken only by rain, tapping the windows and the jazz humming from the old record player. Elena was polishing glasses that were already clean for the 3rd time when Vincent's voice drifted from the corner. "You don't have to stand there all night." She looked up, surprised, and saw him watching her with something close to warmth in his steel-gray eyes. "Come, sit." He pointed to the seat across from him in the booth. Elena hesitated for a moment, then set the glass down and walked over. Sitting across from Vincent Moretti in that booth of darkness felt like stepping over a threshold she could never step back from, but she sat anyway. They talked about jazz, about favorite musicians, about whether Miles Davis or John Coltrane was greater, about Chicago, about street corners he had known since he was a boy, about restaurants that had closed and buildings that had been torn down, about the weather, about winter coming, about how Chicago snow could bury the whole city overnight. They talked about everything except that night. No one said Derek Lawson's name. No one spoke of the blood on the table. No one mentioned the dent still pressed into the oak like a scar that would never heal. It was an unspoken agreement between them, a boundary they both respected. And when the night ended and Elena stood to lock up the restaurant, she realized that for the first time in years, she had spoken with a man without feeling afraid. 3 weeks passed like a strange dream Elena did not dare believe was real. And the nights of talking with Vincent in that booth of darkness became a habit, a private ritual they both looked forward to, but neither of them ever admitted out loud. They talked about books, about movies, about places Vincent had been in his life, and places Elena dreamed of seeing someday, but they never talked about themselves, never dug into the wounds hiding under the surface, until that night, a quiet Tuesday with a fine drizzle tapping the glass outside and the restaurant long since closed. Harold had gone home, Rosa had turned off the stoves and said goodbye, and only Elena remained cleaning up, while Vincent sat in his usual booth, a second espresso gone cold in front of him, and Elena did not know what had shifted, did not know why the walls she had built over 4 years suddenly began to crack. But when she sat down across from Vincent, as she always did, the words spilled out of her like a river breaking its banks. "His name was Marcus," she began, her voice small as a whisper, and she did not look into Vincent's eyes but down at her hands laced together on the tabletop. "I met him when I was 23. I thought he was perfect." The words she had buried for 4 years began to pour free. The first time she had ever told anyone. The first time she let those dark memories stand in the light. And she told him about the early days, when Marcus was the most charming man she had ever met, with a sun-bright smile and sweet promises of a perfect future. She told him how he slowly isolated her from friends and family, how he convinced her no one loved her the way he did, how he turned their Detroit apartment into a prison she did not recognize until it was too late. 4 years. 4 years in a hell she had called love, and every time she did something wrong, whether she burned dinner a little or came home 5 minutes late, Marcus would teach her a lesson, sometimes a slap, sometimes a punch to the stomach where no one would see the bruises, sometimes fingers tightening around her throat until she nearly blacked out, and after every time he would cry, apologize, swear it would never happen again, and she believed him. She always believed him, because belief was the only thing that kept her alive. He cut her off from everyone, controlled every call, every message, every step she took, and she had no friends, no family, no one to run to, only Marcus and the lies he fed her every day, that she was useless, that no one would love her but him, that she deserved what she got. Elena's voice trembled when she described the night she escaped. Marcus drunk after a party, passed out on the sofa with an empty whiskey bottle beside him, and she lay awake all night watching him sleep until something inside her broke, or maybe finally healed, and she quietly took his wallet, took all the cash, stuffed a few clothes into a backpack, and walked out of that apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning without looking back. She ran to the bus station, bought a ticket to Cleveland, and did not stop running for the next 4 months. Cleveland, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and finally Chicago. Each city a new name, a new story, a new fear as she glanced over her shoulder to see whether Marcus was watching. She knew he was looking for her. He would never let her go. And in his mind she belonged to him, and what belonged to Marcus Webb would take back, no matter the cost. Through all of it, Vincent said nothing, sitting still as stone, steel-gray eyes never leaving her face, listening, truly listening. With a complete attention Elena had never received from anyone, and he did not interrupt, did not offer useless advice, did not say hollow lines like, "Everything will be okay," that she had heard too many times. He only listened, and somehow his silence comforted her more than words ever had. When Elena finally stopped, her throat raw and her eyes wet with tears, she had not realized she was crying. Vincent stayed quiet a long time, and then he spoke, and the question froze her. What's his full name? Not "Are you okay?" Not "I'm sorry that happened to you." Just a simple, practical, cold question. The question of a man collecting information. Elena looked into those steel-gray eyes and understood exactly what he was asking. Not casual curiosity, but an offer disguised as a question. And she could refuse. She could shake her head and change the subject, and Vincent would not push. But if she answered, if she handed him that name, she knew exactly what would happen. She would be placing a bullet in the hand of one of the most dangerous men in Chicago, and that bullet would never be removed from the magazine. She should have been afraid. She should have hesitated. But when she thought of the nights of beatings, the days locked inside that apartment, the years stolen from her, she felt nothing but a strange calm. "Marcus Webb," she said, her voice not trembling now. "From Detroit." Vincent nodded slowly, and she could see him memorizing the name, carving it into his mind with the precision of a computer. And he promised nothing, said nothing about what he would do, only nodded and took a sip of cold espresso, as if they had been talking about the weather. But Elena knew. She had just planted a seed in the richest soil imaginable, and one day that seed would bloom into something Marcus Webb could never outrun. 2 months passed, and if someone looked at Elena Blackwood now and compared her to the trembling girl behind the bar on that first night, they would not believe it was the same person, because the change did not arrive overnight. It came the way dawn seeps into darkness, a little each day, a little each week, until one morning Elena stood in front of the mirror and no longer recognized the woman staring back. Her dark brown hair was no longer twisted tight at the nape like a clenched fist. Now it fell looser, sometimes spilling over her shoulders, sometimes held back with a simple clip, free in a way she had not allowed herself for years. The white shirt buttoned all the way to her throat had been replaced by tops with more open collars, not provocative, just normal, as if she no longer had to hide every centimeter of skin to feel safe. And the long sleeves she used to wear to cover the scars on her wrists, sometimes she still wore them, but sometimes, on hot days, she rolled them up, and if anyone noticed those faint lines, she did not feel shame anymore, because they were part of her, a map of the road she had survived, and she had learned that survival was not something to hide. The change was not only on the outside either. Elena learned things no school ever taught. Lessons delivered not in speeches but in observation, in nights spent across from Vincent Moretti in the dark booth, watching the way he existed in the world. She learned how to read a room the moment she stepped into it, how to sweep her eyes over every face and decide who was a threat, who might be an ally, who could be ignored. She learned how to stand, no longer curled in on herself as if trying to shrink and disappear into a wall, but upright, shoulders open, claiming space as if she had a right to be there, because she did. She learned how to speak, no longer with the trembling whisper of someone asking permission to exist, but with a clear, decisive voice, the voice of a person who knew what she wanted and was not afraid to demand it. Vincent never sat her down and taught these things formally, but he did not need to, because she learned by watching him, by absorbing how he moved, how he spoke, how he controlled every situation without raising his voice or making threats. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to apply those lessons to her own life. The moment that marked the full turn came on a crowded Saturday night, when a middle-aged man with a face flushed red from alcohol started causing trouble. He had drunk too much, his voice grew louder than it should have, and when Elena passed his table, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, a gesture that yanked her straight back to the nightmare 2 months earlier, back to Derek Lawson and that rough clamp like a pair of pliers. But this time Elena did not freeze, she did not panic, she did not tremble, she did not plead. She simply stopped, looked down at the hand holding her wrist, then lifted her eyes and looked the drunk man straight in the face with a stare so cold it made him flinch. She told him he had 10 seconds to pay his bill and leave the restaurant, or her friend in the corner would help him. And she did not have to point, did not have to explain, because the man, even drunk, was sober enough for survival to wake up. He looked toward the dark corner booth where a motionless silhouette sat, and even if he could not see the face clearly, he could feel the steel-gray eyes fixed on him, and his hand released Elena's wrist as if he had touched fire. He fumbled for his wallet, left a messy pile of cash on the table without counting it, and staggered out of the restaurant in less than 5 seconds. Elena stood there for a moment watching the door swing shut behind him, and she felt something strange spreading through her chest. Not relief, not victory, but a feeling she had not known in years, confidence, strength, the quiet shock of realizing she had protected herself not by running or begging, but by standing still and facing what was in front of her. She turned her gaze toward the dark booth, and for the first time in the 2 months she had known him, she saw Vincent Moretti smile. Not the thin blade of a smile from before he acted, not the polite mask of social courtesy, but a real smile, slight at the corners, softening the hard angles of his stone face. Later, when she brought his espresso, he looked at her with something in his steel-gray eyes she could not name. Maybe respect, maybe pride, maybe something deeper. Neither of them was ready to admit, and he told her she had not needed him. Elena set the espresso down and smiled, the first truly bright smile she had worn in years, and she admitted she had not, but it was nice to know he was there. That night, when Elena cleared Vincent's table after he had left, she found the tip as usual, 10 times the bill, folded neatly beneath the espresso saucer. But this time there was something else too, a small piece of paper folded in half with a handwritten line in black ink. Vincent's handwriting she recognized instantly, sharp and precise like the man himself, and there were only 2 words on it. Yet those 2 words carried more weight than 1,000 spoken lines. Proud of you. Elena stood there for a long time staring down at the note in her hand, and she felt tears rise, spilling before she could stop them. But this time they were not tears of pain or fear, they were the tears of someone who had walked a long road and finally been seen, finally been acknowledged, finally been someone another person could be proud of. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket close to her heart, where she would keep it forever as a reminder that she was not a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and she was growing stronger every day. Something had changed between them, a subtle shift in the air whenever they were close, as if the atmosphere itself had grown thicker, heavier with things that were never spoken aloud. What Elena had with Vincent was no longer as simple as protector and protected. It had evolved into something more complicated, more dangerous, something they both felt but neither dared to name. Elena noticed first, one afternoon as she was getting ready for the evening shift, and caught herself checking the clock again and again. 6:45, 6:50, 6:55, her heart picking up speed as the minute hand crept toward 12, and when 7 o'clock came and the door opened and that familiar silhouette in a charcoal suit stepped inside, A wave of relief and excitement washed through her body that she could not explain. It was not the feeling of safety a victim feels when her guardian appears. It was something else entirely. Something that warmed her cheeks and made her turn away to hide the smile rising at the corners of her mouth. She began to notice small things she had once overlooked, the way Vincent always chose the seat with a clear view of the entrance. Yet his eyes drifted toward the bar where she stood more often than they watched the door. The way he always ordered espresso and rarely finished it, as if the drink were only an excuse to sit there. The way his steel-gray gaze seemed to soften a fraction, only a fraction, when it landed on her, as if the eternal ice were melting at the edges. Elena wondered whether she was imagining it, whether she was seeing what was not there because she wanted it to be there. But then, on late nights when they sat across from each other in the dark booth, she would catch him looking at her with an expression she could not decode, and she knew she was not imagining. Something was happening between them, something neither of them had the courage to say out loud. Vincent knew too, in his own way. He had lived 36 years without needing anyone, had built an empire out of blood and violence without letting a single person get close enough to become a weakness. Yet here, inside this small restaurant in the middle of Chicago's South Side, he found something he did not know he had been searching for. Peace. For the first time in years, he had a place he could go without being on guard every second, a place where he could lower his shield, even a little, a place where someone looked at him not with fear or greed but with something close to acceptance. Dominic, his most loyal bodyguard, had noticed the change long ago, and one night as they sat in the glossy black SUV parked outside Moretti's corner, Dominic finally asked the question he had been carrying for weeks. "Why this restaurant every night, boss?" His voice neutral, not judging, only curious. "There are 100 places in this city with better espresso." Vincent did not answer. He only stared through the window at the restaurant, where the warm yellow light spilled out like a beacon in the night. And Dominic was smart enough not to ask again, but between them stood barriers as high as mountains, walls built from the past and from fear. Vincent was Mafia, a boss, a man with hands stained by the blood of countless enemies, living in a world where violence was the main language and death waited at every street corner, and pulling Elena into that world would put her in the crosshairs of every enemy he had ever made, and he had made many. And Elena had only just escaped 4 years under the hand of a controlling man, 4 years imprisoned inside a toxic relationship that had nearly crushed her. So how could she trust again? How could she open herself to another man, especially a man 100 times more dangerous than Marcus? She had fought too hard to claw back her freedom and independence, and the thought of depending on anyone again, even Vincent Moretti, made her shiver. So they kept their distance, sitting across from each other in the dark booth, talking about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the subjects that might carry them into dangerous territory. Sometimes, in a moment of carelessness, their hands would brush when Elena set the espresso down, and electricity would snap through that touch like a small bolt of lightning, and they would both pull back, both look away, both pretend nothing had happened, but they both knew, they both felt it. There was a fire smoldering between them, held back by reason and fear. Yet with each day that passed it burned a little higher, a little hotter, a little more dangerous, and the tension they refused to resolve kept building like pressure inside a bomb with a ticking timer. And both Elena and Vincent knew that sooner or later something would have to explode. They just did not know when, and they did not know what would be left after the blast. 3 months had passed since the first night, and Elena's life had found a new rhythm, a fragile but precious stability she had learned to cherish. Each evening she worked, she talked with Vincent in the dark corner booth, and she went home with the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. But tonight was different. Tonight, for the first time in 3 months, Vincent did not come. She had received a text from an unknown number that afternoon, only a few short words. "Business tonight, won't make it, V." She knew it was him. Knew that in his world there were nights when business could not be delayed. Nights when a mafia boss had to do what a mafia boss had to do. She did not ask, did not demand an explanation, only read the message and slipped her phone into her pocket with a small disappointment she tried to hide even from herself. Yet all night she could not stop looking toward the empty booth, could not stop feeling hollow, as if part of the room had disappeared. By 9 o'clock in the evening the restaurant was almost empty. Rosa had gone home with back pain. Harold was doing the books in the office behind the kitchen, and only a few scattered customers remained finishing their meals. Elena was wiping down table 8 by the window, the damp cloth moving in circles over the glossy wood. When the bell over the door rang, a familiar sound she had heard thousands of times, but tonight something made the hair rise on the back of her neck before she even looked up. A premonition, a primal instinct sharpened by 4 years of living in hell. She raised her head and the world stopped. Her heart missed a beat in a moment that stretched like eternity. Her blood seemed to congeal in her veins. And all the strength, all the confidence she had built over the last 3 months vanished like morning mist in sunlight. Standing in the doorway, wearing the smile she had once loved and then learned to fear, was Marcus Webb. He was still as handsome as she remembered, handsome in the dangerous way of a venomous snake whose scales gleam under the sun. His blonde hair was slicked back without a strand out of place, perfect as if he had stepped out of a magazine photo shoot. His summer sky blue eyes, the eyes she once drowned in, looked at her now with a terrifying sense of ownership. He wore an expensive navy suit, perhaps even more expensive than anything he had owned back when they were together, and his polished leather shoes caught and reflected the restaurant's light. He looked successful, charming, completely ordinary, like a thriving businessman stopping in for a late dinner, and only Elena knew the monster hiding beneath that flawless surface. "There you are, baby," Marcus said, his voice sweet as honey, as if they had been apart for only a few days instead of the 4 months she had spent running in desperation. He stepped into the restaurant, and the door clicked shut behind him. A small sound like the lock of a cage. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Did you really think you could disappear? A customer posted a photo on social media, just a harmless selfie, but you were in the background. I'd recognize you anywhere." Each of his footsteps on the wooden floor sounded like a countdown to the end of the world, and Elena stood frozen, the cloth slipping from fingers gone numb without her noticing. Her body betrayed her, snapping back to old instincts programmed into her by 4 years of abuse. "Lower your head, avoid his eyes, make yourself small. Do not speak, do not run. Running only makes it worse." Every lesson she had learned from Vincent, every ounce of confidence she had built, dissolved the moment she faced the nightmare that had shaped her. Marcus moved closer, and Elena could not move, could not scream, could do nothing but stand there like a deer hypnotized by headlights just before the impact. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he always wore, a scent she once loved and now made her stomach turn. His hand lifted, fingers cold as ice resting on her cheek, and she shuddered without meaning to. "Time to come home, Elena," he said, his fingertips stroking her cheek with a counterfeit tenderness she knew could turn to violence in a heartbeat. "I've missed you so much. I've changed, baby. I went to therapy, just like you always wanted. I'm a different man now." The lies flowed from his mouth, smooth as silk, the same lies she had heard 1,000 times before, after every beating, after every time she lay crying on the floor with blood on her lip. Elena looked around in desperation, searching for help, searching for anyone who might intervene. The last customers had left without her noticing. Harold was still in his office with the door shut tight, and Vincent, the only one who could stand against Marcus, was not here. She was alone, completely alone, and when her eyes returned to Marcus's blue gaze, she saw a flash of victory glittering there, and she understood. He had been watching. He had been observing, maybe for weeks, waiting for the perfect night, the night the mysterious protector did not appear. Marcus Webb never moved without a plan, and tonight every piece had fallen into place. His mouth curved into a smile only she understood, the smile of a predator that has driven its prey into a corner, and the hand on her cheek tightened a fraction, just enough to remind her what he could do if she did not behave. Marcus kept talking, his voice a symphony of manipulation polished by years of practice, every word chosen with care to spear straight through her defenses. "I've changed, Elena. I really have. I went to therapy, twice a week for 4 months. I understand now why I did those things. It was the stress, the pressure, my childhood trauma. But I've worked through it all. I'm not that man anymore." He looked at her with blue eyes full of counterfeit sincerity, and for one terrifying moment Elena felt a part of her want to believe him. That part was the 23-year-old girl she used to be, the girl who had loved Marcus Webb with her whole naive heart, the girl still hiding somewhere deep inside her and craving love so badly she would forgive anything. That part whispered that maybe he was telling the truth, maybe people could change, maybe this time would be different. But another part of her, the part that had survived hell, the part that had seen the truth behind the mask 100 times, was screaming that this was a trap, that these words were bait, that if she bit down again she would never get out. And then, in the middle of the war tearing her apart, another voice rose inside her. Not Marcus's, not fear's, but Vincent Moretti's low, steady voice echoing from the nights in the dark booth. "Take up space. Don't fold in. Stand straight. Look them in the eye. Never let anyone make you feel small. Those lessons cut through the fog of terror like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Elena drew in a deep breath and felt air fill her lungs, and she found something in the bottom of herself she thought she had lost. Courage, anger, the refusal to accept the role of victim again. She stepped back, slipping out from under Marcus's hand on her cheek, and when she lifted her chin and looked straight into his blue eyes, her voice came out clearer and firmer than it ever had in her life. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus. Not now, not ever." The change in Marcus's face happened in an instant. As if someone had ripped a mask away, the sweet smile vanished, the fake sincerity snuffed out like a candle, and what remained underneath was what Elena had learned to fear over 4 years. The blue eyes turned cold as ice, his jaw clenched, and a dark rage began to boil just beneath the surface. "You think you can just leave me?" His voice was not sweet anymore. It was the growl of an animal that had been denied, thick with threat and danger. "You think after everything I did for you, you can just walk away? I own you, Elena. I will always own you." His hand shot out fast as a striking snake, fingers clamping around her wrist with such force she could feel bone complain under the pressure. She cried out, trying to yank herself free, but Marcus was too strong, and the familiar fear began to rise inside her like a tide. Rosa Martinez had returned to the restaurant to pick up the wallet she had left in the kitchen, and when she pushed through the back door, what she saw made her blood turn to ice. A strange man was crushing Elena's wrist, the young woman's face washed pale with pain and fear. Rosa did not hesitate, did not stand there weighing options, her 55-year-old body moving faster than it had in years, as she rushed into the kitchen, trembling hands yanking open the drawer, where she kept the small slip of paper with the emergency number Vincent had left weeks earlier. She dialed, heart pounding like a war drum, and when someone answered on the other end, she whispered in a panicked voice that there was a man hurting Elena and they had to come now, please. Out in the dining room, the situation escalated fast. Harold Chen heard the cry and hurried out of his office, his old face going pale when he saw what was happening. "Let her go," he said, his voice shaking but trying to hold steady. "I'm calling the police." Marcus only laughed. A cold, vicious sound, and with his free hand he drew a knife from inside his suit jacket, the steel blade flashing under the yellow light. "Stay back, old man," he snarled, swinging the knife toward Harold and forcing the restaurant owner to retreat in fear. "This is between me and my wife. If you call anyone, I'll gut you like a fish." He began dragging Elena toward the door, fingers still locked around her wrist, and she fought. She tried to resist, tried to grab onto anything she could, but he was too strong and she was too afraid. The restaurant door drew closer and closer, and Elena knew that if she crossed it, she would never come back. And then the door opened, not blasted off its hinges like the night Derek Lawson stormed in, with no violent sound, no threat. It opened quietly, calmly, as if someone were stepping into a gathering where they knew they were the guest of honor. Vincent Moretti stood in the doorway, charcoal suit without a wrinkle, face the familiar stone mask, and steel-gray eyes fixed on Marcus Webb with a calm that was more frightening than rage. Marcus froze, the knife angled toward the newcomer, and for a second Elena saw something she had never seen in Marcus's blue eyes before: uncertainty. He did not know who this man was, did not know what he was facing, and for the first time in his life Marcus Webb was no longer the most dangerous man in the room. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus barked, trying to keep his swagger. Vincent stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him like the sound of a gun being cocked, and his voice carried through the air that had gone so quiet it was suffocating. "I'm the man who's going to give you a choice, Marcus Webb." The way he said Marcus's name, slow and clear like a death sentence, made a spark of hope flare inside Elena's chest, and she knew the darkness had returned, but this time it had not come to swallow her. Marcus reacted on pure instinct, the instinct of a man cornered, jerking Elena tight against him, twisting her into a living shield, and pressing the ice-cold blade to her throat. Elena felt the sharp steel laid against her skin, and she understood with a sick clarity that one more ounce of pressure would mean blood, so she did not dare breathe, did not dare swallow, did not dare do anything that might make the blade bite deeper. "Stay back," Marcus snarled, and the confidence he had walked in with was gone, replaced by the panic of an animal that suddenly realizes it is the one being hunted. "I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll slit her throat right here." Vincent stopped, his steel-gray eyes taking in the situation with the calm of a man who had faced death so many times it no longer impressed him, and then he did something that surprised both Marcus and Elena. He slipped a hand into his suit pocket, drew out a pack of cigarettes and a silver lighter, and lit one with steady, unhurried ease. Smoke lifted into the air as Vincent took a long drag, then looked Marcus straight in the eye. "You have until I finish this cigarette," he said, his voice low as distant thunder. "That's how long you have to make peace with whatever God you believe in." Elena stood there with the knife still at her throat, and inside the chaos of fear and despair, part of her mind began to work with a strange, razor-clean clarity. She remembered the late-night conversations with Vincent, the unofficial lessons he had offered through stories and advice that had seemed casual at the time. "When someone holds you from behind," he had said once, "they expect you to try to pull back or lunge forward. They don't expect you to go down. Lower your center, turn, make space." The words played in her head like music, and she knew this was the moment that would decide everything. She could stand here and wait for someone to save her, or she could save herself. She had spent 4 years as Marcus Webb's victim. She would not give him one more second. Elena moved, with no warning, no tell, dropping suddenly to her knees, lowering her weight in a sharp, abrupt collapse, and turning hard to the left at the same time. Marcus did not react fast enough. The blade caught her shoulder as she twisted, pain flaring like fire. But she did not stop. The momentum carried her out of his arms and into a roll to the side. Blood began to seep through her shirt, the cut not deep but sharp enough to burn. Yet she was free, no longer a shield, and that was all that mattered. Vincent moved in the same instant. Elena broke away, as if they had practiced this 1,000 times, crossing the space between them at a speed the eye could not hold, and before Marcus could understand what was happening, he was on the floor with Vincent on top of him. The knife skittered off into the shadows somewhere. The violence began, but it was not wild or uncontrolled. It was calculated brutality. Each punch placed exactly where it would do what it was meant to do, with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. "This is for every bruise you left on her body," Vincent said, his tone calm as if reading a grocery list, as his fist drove into Marcus's face. "This is for every night she couldn't sleep because she was afraid of you." Another punch, the sound of bone giving way in the tight air. "This is for every tear she cried, every scar she hides, every piece of herself she lost because of you." Marcus was not screaming anymore. He could only moan, and the handsome face Elena remembered was becoming a swollen mess of bruised flesh and blood. Vincent did not stop until he was certain the message had been delivered, until Marcus Webb's face itself became a warning no one could misunderstand. Elena stood with her back against the wall, one hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder, and she watched it all. And she had thought she would be afraid, would be sickened by the violence unfolding in front of her, but what she felt was something else entirely. Release. For 4 years she had lived in fear of the man now lying broken on the floor. For 4 years she had run, looked over her shoulder, startled at unfamiliar footsteps, and now, watching Marcus Webb crushed beneath Vincent Moretti's hands, she felt the last invisible chains fall away. She was not a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and the man who had hunted her was now nothing but battered flesh begging for mercy. The door opened and Dominic stepped in with 2 other men, their faces empty as they took in the scene. Vincent rose, adjusted the cuff of his suit as if he had just finished ordinary office work, and nodded toward Marcus. "Take him," he said. "Far, very far, and make sure he understands that if he ever comes back, if he ever even thinks about her again, what happened tonight will feel like a massage compared to what comes next." Dominic nodded, and the 2 men hauled Marcus up and dragged that half-living body out of the restaurant, and Marcus Webb would disappear, not dead, because death was too easy, but gone to a place very far away, where he would have plenty of time to think about what he had done. When the door closed behind Dominic, Vincent turned back to Elena. He stepped to her, his steel-gray eyes pausing on the wound at her shoulder, and for the first time that night something other than coldness crossed his face. Worry, tenderness. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, and his hand lifted, hesitated for a beat, then touched her arm gently, careful to stay away from the cut. Elena looked into those steel-gray eyes, the eyes of the man who had just destroyed the person who had hunted her for years, the eyes of the devil who had stepped out of the dark to protect her, and she smiled. The first real smile since Marcus had walked in, the smile of someone whose final shackles had just been unlocked. "I'm free," she said, and her voice rang like a declaration, like a truth finally spoken aloud. "For the first time in 4 years, I'm finally free." 6 months had passed since that first night, the night 5 wolves burst into the restaurant, and a devil stepped out of the dark to crush them. 6 months of healing, of change, of learning how to live again after forgetting you were still alive. Elena Blackwood stood in the middle of Moretti's corner late one night, a cleaning cloth in her hand, Warm yellow light pooled over chairs and tables that had been set back neatly after closing. She moved through the room with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged here. Shoulders straight, chin lifted, footsteps steady on the wooden floor. She stopped at table 12, the large oak table in the center of the restaurant. Her pale green eyes settled on a single point in the glossy surface where the dent still lived deep and unmistakable as the day it was made. It was a scar in the wood that would never fade. Harold had offered to replace it again and again in those early weeks, saying it ruined the restaurant's aesthetics, saying customers asked about it. He said he could buy a new table within days, but Vincent had said no in a voice that allowed no argument, and Harold had stopped asking. Now, the dent had become part of the place, part of the story, part of the legend people whispered across the south side. Elena let her finger glide along the dent, feeling its depth, the smoothness of wood rubbed over and over. She remembered that night the feel of her back slamming into this table, the choking fear, and the flood of despair. Yet, the memory no longer held power over her. It was only a story now, a chapter turned in the book of her life. Then, a voice came from the dark booth corner. Elena smiled without turning because she already knew he was there. She could feel his presence the way you feel the heat of a fire. Vincent Moretti stepped out of the shadow in his familiar charcoal suit, his familiar stone face, but his steel-gray eyes softened when they found her. Harold asked again today about replacing the table, Elena said, her finger staying on the scar in the wood. He said customers ask about it. Vincent stood beside her, looking down at the mark. His voice dropped when he replied, "Let them ask. That mark is not there to remind you of what they did to you. It is there to remind everyone else what happens when they cross the line." They stood in silence for a moment, two figures in an empty restaurant. Then, Vincent held out his hand. "Come, I'll walk you out." Elena placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth as their fingers laced. Together, they stepped through the door into the Chicago cold, where the wind of November cut through layers of clothing. But Elena did not hunch the way she once did. She stood tall, drew the cold air deep into her lungs, and felt life moving through her veins. The street lay quiet, streetlights flickered weakly, and somewhere in the darkness, a police siren echoed like a reminder that the outside world was still dangerous, the way it had always been. Yet here, beside Vincent Moretti at the entrance of the restaurant that carried his name, Elena felt safe in a way she had never felt in her life. Vincent looked at her, steel-gray eyes catching the streetlight, his voice coming out like a vow. "You are safe here. As long as that table stands, as long as I am breathing, no one will ever hurt you again." Elena met that gaze, the eyes of the man who had saved her not once but many times, the eyes of a devil who had become her guardian angel. She smiled with the calm of someone who has finally reached shore after a long storm and said two simple words, "I know." Inside those words lived all her trust, all her gratitude, everything she could not put into language. Vincent nodded, a small gesture of understanding, then turned up his suit collar against the wind and stepped into the dark. Elena watched until his shape dissolved into the night, becoming one with the shadow he had been born from and would always belong to. She turned back for one last look at the restaurant, warm yellow light still spilling from the windows like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. Then she turned on her heel and walked toward the small apartment she called home, along a route she would not have dared take alone 6 months earlier. Her steps rang on the sidewalk, steady and sure, not rushed, not afraid. She did not look over her shoulder, did not flinch at unfamiliar sounds, did not fold in when a passing figure moved nearby. She simply walked with head high and shoulders open, taking up space as if it belonged to her, because it did. The world belonged to her not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of a person who has the right to exist, the right to take up space, the right to live without fear. Elena Blackwood had once been the girl curled in a dark corner, afraid of the door chime, afraid of a man's hand, afraid of her own voice. She had once believed she was born to be a victim, that her fate was endurance and silence. But she had been wrong. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, someone who walked through hell and came out the other side with her soul intact, someone who learned to rise after being knocked down, learned to say no after years of only saying yes, learned to love herself after being taught she was unworthy of love. The scar on her shoulder would fade with time, but the strength she had found would remain. The dent in the oak table would stay as a reminder not of the pain she endured, but of the price paid by those who dared cause that pain. And somewhere in the darkness of Chicago a man stood watch, not because she was weak, but because in his eyes she was worth protecting. She was Elena Blackwood. She was no longer a victim. She was the one who could stand in the eye of the storm and feel its quiet. The story of Elena and Vincent was not only a story of love or redemption, it was also a deep lesson in inner strength and the human capacity to be reborn. Because no matter how far life pushes us into darkness, no matter how badly we are wounded, there is always a way to stand up and keep going. And sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, from people society might judge wrong. And more than anything, a person's true value is not in what they have been through, but in how they choose to live after the pain. Thank you for following this story all the way to the end. If you feel this story touched your heart, please press the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you do not miss the exciting videos every day. A like and a share from you will be a huge source of motivation that helps us continue bringing you more meaningful stories. What did you feel about this story? Have you ever met or known someone who has gone through similar circumstances in real life? Please share your feelings in the comments below. We truly look forward to hearing the thoughts that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish all of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.